So, welcome everyone to our January program for the Camano Wildlife Habitat Project. Our speaker is Delaney Anderson with Snohomish Conservation District. She will be speaking to us on native plants to promote wildlife with environmental considerations. And I've got the wrong window up. Here we go. Okay. Val normally does the introduction, but she's traveling now. So I'm just going to proceed onward. I think Delaney is going to fill you in on a lot of the things that Val normally does to promote wildlife habitat. So I'll just tell you a little bit about her. She graduated from WSU with a bachelor's degree in Earth and Environmental Science. After college, she worked with Snake River salmon as part of the Smolt Monitoring Program. She also worked on the disposal and shutdown of nuclear waste buildings at the Hanford site, which sounds like a really impressive thing to me. And most recently served with the Washington Conservation Corps restoration crew in King County. Now she works with the Snohomish Conservation District to assist habitat restoration projects as an individual placement for the Washington Conservation Corps. Welcome, Delaney.
Thank you. Thank you for that great introduction. I'm really excited to be here presenting tonight for all of you. Hopefully this all goes well. I'm not used to presenting over Zoom, but I think we've got everything figured out. So that's, my name is Delaney Anderson. I'm here to present about native plants to promote wildlife with environmental considerations. I'm working with the Snohomish Conservation District, and we are having our annual native plant sale next Tuesday. So a good portion of this is in consideration of that to promote our native plant sale and highlight some other great ways to access, get new plants if that's something you guys are all interested in. So I'll just jump right into it. I want to give a brief thank you acknowledgement to Camano Wildlife Habitat Project for hosting me here tonight. I know you guys do a lot of great work, and so I'm happy to be here presenting and a part of it. And before I really dive into it, I want to take a second to acknowledge the land that we're living on. Camano Island incorporates the traditional territory of a number of tribes that includes Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla tribes, Hokuminum Treaty Group, Skagit, Tulalip, Stillaguamish, and Kikialis tribes. A little bit about me, though I did get a brief introduction, so I'll try not to jump over that again. I grew up in Eastern Washington in Tri-Cities, and the land over there is very different than what I'm experiencing now over here. It was a lot drier, and the plants were very different. A lot of sagebrush, a lot of tumbleweeds, you can imagine. And that inspired me in a lot of ways because all of my vacations were camping in the Cascades and doing different outdoorsy things, getting away from that desert habitat. And so it created a huge longing for really diverse ecosystems. And so when I got to college at Washington State University, that is what I decided to pursue. I did have a major in wildlife ecology and conservation, so I have some background in wildlife, and it's really exciting for me to get to dive back into it after a number of years away. Spent a couple years working with salmon on the Snake River, a couple years working with the Hanford site, shutting down nuclear waste buildings. And then just a year and a half ago, I moved over to Seattle area and was on a Washington Conservation Corps crew. And that's where all of these pictures are coming from. I was on a rural crew, so we did a lot of work on farmland and streamside habitat, creating those riparian buffers that salmon really need in order for their populations to stay strong. I met a lot of great people doing that. and had a lot of really cool experiences. So I decided to do another year, but this time moving a bit more north. That was down in Renton. And now I'm with Snohomish Conservation District doing my IP year. So a little background on what a conservation district is. We offer free technical assistance and financial assistance to landowners here in the area. So this is what partially funded by taxpayers and largely funded by grants. Because of that, we're able to offer non-regulatory advice to landowners on what they can do with their properties. A lot of times, landowners will reach out to us. In fact, I think all the time, they'll reach out to us and have specific things that they want addressed, or specific things that they want guidance on. Maybe they want to create trails on their property. They're seeing if they can create a bridge over a stream that goes through their land. So we have that technical expertise to give them that advice and be able to highlight policies that need permitting, policies that exist that would require permitting. And it's a way that we can give back to the community while also, developing land in a way that's beneficial for all of us. Across the United States, nearly 3,000 conservation districts offer free help to residents to steward land, water, forests, wildlife, and related natural resources. This began in the Dust Bowl era, and now it's really just for the sake of conserving land and making sure that we're using the land that we have in the best ways that we can. And so I'm really excited to be a part of all that. So a brief overview of what I plan to talk about in this presentation. I'll start with the importance of wildlife and pollinator species. There's a large variety that we get in the Pacific Northwest, which is really great. And there are a number of things that we can do to foster that. And so I'll dive into the native plants that specifically, I'll go over the ones that Snohomish Conservation District is selling in our annual native plant sale. But there are also a number of others that we won't be selling that are available from retailers around the county that are available for landowners as well. You don't need to be a wholesale buyer in order to get plants. It is a great resource to have Snohomish Conservation District's annual plant sale though. And I'll dive in a little bit to the challenges our environment faces. And I know with climate change and development, it increases the likelihood that we're seeing a lot of these events. And there are ways that native plants can help mitigate some of the fallout from these environmental forces. So jumping right into it, there is an increasing need for connectivity. If you can see the photo on the left, it is vastly different from what our land looks like just a couple years ago, and maybe even more so today. And that just means that it's important what we do with the land that we have. Over the decades and centuries, there's been significant development, and this causes problems for us along with wildlife. Though it is hugely important that wildlife has corridors connecting natural spaces. Populations really hurt when they don't have access to all the things they need. So it's important that we use our land in wise ways. So why go native? One of the best benefits to native plants is that they're already adapted to the climate that we see here in the Pacific Northwest. They have a natural ability to resist native pests and diseases. They require less water once established, which is really great in those dry summer months that you don't need to keep watering them. And they provide year-round habitat and resources for local wildlife. Why are pollinators important? So 1/3 of our food is dependent on pollination. And if we lose our pollinators, then we're going to have to spend a lot more money and time in order to be able to feed all of the people that we have on this beautiful planet. Pollinators are essential to food and habitat availability of other species. So beyond just providing food for us, they also provide food for a lot of other wildlife. It's a cyclical system, and we all benefit one another in a balanced ecosystem. So 85% of flowering plants are pollinator dependent. And these are all essential to air quality, soil health, and wildlife. So there's maybe some discussion here depending on what your land looks like and what you want from your plants and your home. And so that poses the question, are these wildlife considered friends or foes to us? And that includes animals like beaver, deer, birds, bees, maybe elk, depending on where you're living, and rabbits. A lot of these species are very important to seed dispersal, from birds to deer eating it and pooping it out, or just like squirrels picking it up, dropping it, burying it somewhere and forgetting where that went. They're hugely important to spreading the native wildlife that keeps the Pacific Northwest as beautiful as we all know it to be. They also have the benefit of eating less favorable pests. Mosquitoes is one that I am particularly not fond of. So I love that birds are interested in food sources of all kinds. They do some pruning for us depending on how adamantly they get after the species that we have. It can be really beneficial for species like willow, that when you cut them to the stump, they can just sprout back even larger. And wildlife really help the process of nutrient cycling and creating habitat for other wildlife. These beavers are habitat pioneers. They create habitat for plenty of other wildlife, including salmon. And that's a huge part of our way of life, is the salmon that exists here. So there are a number of things that wildlife need. They need food. This comes from a variety of different sources, depending on the wildlife that we're talking about. And I'll go over all of that. They need water, whether it's to drink or to cool themselves off in the summer months. Water is hugely important. They need cover and shelter from predator species, and they need a place to raise their young. So when you're looking at your backyard and trying to decide what you want, just getting started, there are a number of things that are important to consider. One is water flow and topography. So when it rains, where does it flow off? Where does it hang out? What kind of soil texture you have in all seasons, whether it's the rainy, wet months or it's the dry summer months. It's important to know where that water is starting, where it's going, and where it's staying. It's important to know the soil type, whether it's more on the silty side, clay side, or loam side, or if it's a nice balance of the three. There are a number of great ways to figure that out. I have done my fair share of Google searches, and there's a fun activity with a mason jar, shaking it up in water to see the layers of silt, clay, and loam. And it seems like, honestly, a great activity to do with kids, just to explain that our soil is made of a lot of different parts. And it's really useful to know for ourselves when deciding what plants to plant. There are plants that do really well in coarser soils, and there are plants that do just fine in really fine or sandy soils. And so it's useful to have as much information as we can, including how much sun your backyard is getting, or if you have a lot of large trees creating a lot of shade or any other obstructions. It's worthwhile to know if you get a lot of wind, and if you do, which direction that's coming from. It can help inform where you're planting large trees or which kinds of trees, and I'll dive into that more in later slides. And it's also worthwhile to know what the existing vegetation and wildlife are. If you have plants that are doing really well, it makes sense to plant similar species or more of the same, depending on how diverse your backyard already is or is wanting to be. And if you see certain wildlife there, you're able to decide whether you want more of it, less of it, and cater your plants with that knowledge in mind. So going back to the habitat elements that our wildlife and pollinators need, they need food. This is a twin berry plant, and they have these wonderful berries that pop up, shiny black berries that are great for birds and anyone else that's interested. They need water, and we can provide that in a number of ways if we are looking to promote wildlife. And I think these little water baths for birds are a great way to do that. They need cover, and that can be in a number of different ways, whether that's, leaving little refuse piles for squirrel, rabbits, birds to seek shelter under, or even create nests. Cover is hugely important, and there are a lot of ways that we can go about doing that. And they need places to raise young, and that can be bird boxes, though I would advise caution depending on your level of interest in maintaining the structures that you have on your property. Bird boxes can have a lot of maintenance that go along with it, keeping it clean every year and making sure that you're not attracting other pests or diseases. But if that's an option that you want to pursue, by all means, love bird boxes. Native plants as food. So food is a hugely important part of wildlife, and this can include a number of different sources, be it insects, seeds, nectar, sap, pollen, or berries. One species, the Oregon stonecrop, is great for attracting insects, which in turn attracts birds and keeps us all happy. Oregon stonecrop is a beautiful plant. It's great for a drought-tolerant garden. It's got yellow flowers, and I always find it's nice to mix in plants that vary their blooming color. It makes for a more aesthetically pleasing garden, and it attracts birds as well. We're not the only ones that like vibrant colors in our viewing experiences. And Oregon stonecrop is great because it's evergreen. It provides year-round habitat for beneficial insects. It might lose its flowers, but it doesn't lose its leaves. And so it's always great shelter, cover once it starts growing big. Another species, the Western columbine, it has wonderful nectar that birds really love. And a little fun fact I learned just a couple weeks ago is that hummingbirds are not native or not existent on Asian, European, or African continent, on the African continent, which makes them even more special to us here in the American continent. Western columbine grows in open to shaded sites in moist soil. It produces red and yellow flowers, and they're prized by butterflies and hummingbirds, which is always so fun to see. A couple other plants. Red flowering currant is a gorgeous one in the springtime when it blooms, and bees love it. I've seen it myself. They really grow best in full sun, but they do just fine in part shade. Prefer moist to dry soils, and the berries are great for birds as well. Salal is a very good plant for a variety of conditions. It can do sun or shade, moist to dry. Produces small edible berries, and the flowers are prized by bees as well. Dull Oregon grape is a great species. It is very hardy. It does really well kind of most places that you put it. It does prefer more shaded areas and moist soils. It can do in any sort of elevation, and the flowers tend to be early in the spring and produces fruit late in the summer. Vine maple is a large shrub to small tree, depending on how you regard it. Grows in sun to part shade and produces small flowers. And pollinators do love vine maple, though its flowers aren't as extravagant as some of the other plants that we're going over today. One important thing to consider when planting for pollinators is, while we have some native bees that live very short lifespans, there are also bees that have longer lifespans and they need food year-round. So varying the time that plants tend to bloom, having a variety in your yard that bloom in spring to late summer really increases the likelihood that pollinators are going to enjoy your space. And it's something that's not often considered when trying to plant for pollinators and wildlife. And that was something that was brought to my attention that I thought was really smart. Big leaf lupine is a great species for that. It flowers in June and produces seeds and nectar for wildlife. It has this beautiful blue color that is a bit unique compared to a lot of other flowering species. Pacific bleeding heart is one that loves shade and has got a lot of nectar-rich flowers. Butterfly larvae munch on its foliage, and it provides really great cover for amphibians. It loves moist soil, and so it's not uncommon to see it next to a pond or something of the sort. And so it's a good place to get all sorts of wildlife. One slide that I decided to keep in that the previous year's IP taught me, even though, I mean, I'm sure a number of people know it. Goldenrod and aster are two plants that are regarded as aesthetically pleasing. The blue or the purple and the yellow color contrast in a way that is appealing to our eyes, and that's no different for bees. And so when you combine these two plants together, they actually do better than they would do on their own, which is wonderful and exciting. And they're also just beautiful and lovely. Water is a really important resource for wildlife and pollinators. If they can't find water in those dry summer months, especially as it gets drier and our seasons shift a little, it's going to cause a lot of problems if they don't have continued access. And one way that we can help that is by providing water for them year-round. What we want most importantly in a water bath is something that's really shallow with a rough surface. You can imagine if you were walking out onto the ice to try and drink water, you would probably be a bit deterred if every time you walked out you slipped and and lost your balance. So if you have a rough surface, it makes it a lot easier for the birds to stand on, and they're more inclined to use your space. Another way to create a more shallow bath, if you don't have one that's naturally shallow, is you can throw rocks into it. I would recommend using larger rocks. It's going to prevent algae bloom. And it's going to be a lot easier to clean than if you have a bunch of tiny pebbles. And if you want to go above and beyond, use a circulator. Moving water is going to be a lot cleaner. You're going to avoid any algae. You're going to prevent the accumulation of mosquitoes or any larvae. And there's a benefit to the sound of running water. It's pleasing to us, and it's attractive to wildlife as well. And you're really going to see a lot more coming into your space if you have those things that go above and beyond. Water is also hugely important for insects. And one thing that we don't often consider, and there are a number of ways to create that by having large walks that extend beyond the water level, making especially shallow pools, ways that bees can get in and drink water without the risk of drowning. So it's important to consider whether you are creating a water bath for birds or insects when setting up your space. Cover is hugely important to wildlife, especially wildlife that has predators in the area. So layered vegetation is a really great way to create cover for a variety of species. There are a number of ground cover plants that are going to be useful for insects, amphibians, small birds, and shrubs that really branch out and create a lot of cover, hugely important for ground nesting birds. And then it's also really great to have those large overstory trees, just as an extra layer of protection from raptors, though I love raptors as well. There are a number of ways to do this beyond planting native plants. You can also just leave brush piles. It's not as aesthetically pleasing, but a wild garden is a happy garden. You can always create roosting boxes or platforms specifically for wildlife. You can create an insect hotel. I've seen a number of these on Pinterest that look like a luxury resort for any insect that's lucky enough to stumble upon it. And these are all really great projects that wildlife are going to thank you for many years to come. Just going over again the layered canopy. You're going to see a variety of different species in different layers. and the cover that you provide is going to benefit each in turn. So in the overstory canopy, while you may see a larger number of swallows, of hawks, of flycatchers, really fun, active species, you're going to want to have those large trees that kind of tower above. Understory canopy is hugely important. That's going to be like your vine maple. You'll see a lot more woodpeckers, chickadees, nuthatches. Having a shrub layer is hugely important. That'll influence, that'll get you a lot more of those flowering pollinator species, and you'll get to see a lot of hummingbirds, bush tits, dark-eyed juncos, all those happy birds, many of which dark-eyed juncos especially I see year-round. They're out all the time. And a ground layer is really important for ground nesting birds and birds that tend to just hop around rather than flying from branch to branch. The species that are really great for cover, Nootka rose is one that I really love because it has the ability to deter predator species with its thorns, similar to the way that blackberry is really great for species like bunnies. But it does it while being a native plant. And so Nootka rose grows in full sun or perch shade. It creates a thick cover. And the rose hips provide food for birds. So it's more than just bunnies, in case you are of the mind that bunnies eat your happy garden plants. I totally understand. I'm privy to bunnies because I have a pet bunny. So, but Nootka rose is great for birds as well. Sword fern is another really great species for cover, and it's one that I'll touch on again because it's also a great species for slopes. Its roots really dig into the ground and hold firm. And they also have these big leafy plants that are great for insects. It's rare that you look at a fern and you don't see a spider crawling around. And spiders are awesome for taking care of mosquitoes, and I love that for them. Sword fern is also really good at growing in full shade. So if you have a land that's not got the access to sun that some people are lucky to, sword fern is going to do awesome there as well. And it requires a little moisture, so it tolerates it. One more thing that wildlife are going to need in a space is a place to raise their young. This is where it really comes into play that you know what species of birds that you're trying to attract, or pollinators, or wildlife, amphibians, squirrels, anything. It's useful to know what species so you know how they nest. And if you want to go to the extent of supplementing boxes or shelters for these birds, by all means, just know how high they're going to want it, where they're going to want it, make sure it's accessible to the beneficial, the preferred species of bird, and it's not going to be accessible to things like predators. So making sure the entrance holes are the right size, and making sure that you're cleaning it out at the end of their breeding season after the young have hatched and moved on. And vegetation are also just a really great place to raise young if you don't want to go to the extent of creating bird boxes or shelters specifically for birds. They're going to find it in the vegetation as well. They're really good about that. And a number of birds and bees will nest on the bare ground. Approximately 70% of native bee species nest in the ground, That's something really important to remember once it gets to that summer season and we're tempted to mow lawns or we're tempted to, I don't know, run around with the dog. Bees could be nesting there, and there are a number of ways to keep them safe while they nest on the ground, while still being able to use our space. They can burrow. They'll especially like, ground cover species. They're not going to nest in a lawn if they have access to some really great grassy or herbaceous plants. But maybe keeping leaf litter on the ground in those more wild areas, or altering the watering regime so it's not going to drench them in their sleep. There are a number of ways. Bunch grasses, I was just about to touch on, is a great way to create habitat for bees. They really love using abandoned mouse holes and nesting at the base of clumps of grass. There are a number of species too that it's advised to do some pruning on and allow the bees to nest within the inside of like rush species. And those are all great things to consider if you're trying to attract bees. And there's a great graphic, I didn't put it in here, that Snohomish Conservation District has in regards to pruning specifically these like grass type species for bumblebees. And I can throw that in the chat at the end of this if you guys are interested. Another great way to create nests or create habitat for wildlife is by leaving snags. So snags are dead trees that exist within our forest ecosystems that woodpeckers will dive into. Owls love nesting in it. A number of species, whether they're the ones creating the holes for others or whether they're just taking advantage of what has been manufactured by other species. It's great habitat for them all. And this can be a really great way to take advantage if you notice on your property that you have a tree that's looking a little worse for wear and might be on its last legs, so to speak. Turning it into a snag is probably the best way to benefit wildlife while also saving your property from any potential damage from a dead tree topping. Always good to be proactive, and they provide food as well. So slopes are one thing that we as a conservation district get a lot of questions about is how do I plant on my slope? What do I do to prevent erosion? And first and foremost, always seek guidance when planting on a slope. And it depends on the aspect of your slope, what is allowed. So make sure you're seeking a professional and reading the specifics for what's allowed, because there's some things that get tricky if you're not aware. And if you are removing any vegetation on a more gradual slope, always plant afterwards and try your best to limit or reduce the soil disturbance that you have from removing any non-native plants that are existing on that slope, or if you're just, rehoming species, shifting things around, always replant. one great way to plant on slopes is using live stakes because it's limited soil disturbance. You're not taking a shovel and digging out, a chunk of the ground. You're just plopping a stick in. And live stakes always do well to root into the ground and hold it right where you want it. So there are a number of species that do well on slopes. Whether you have a slope that's in full sun or a bit shadier, there's some variety there. I talk a little bit more specifics on the next slide, but I'm going to hang out here for just a second in case anyone wants a mental note of all these species. Snowberry and twinberry can be used as live stakes, but more often than not, you'll see willow species being used as live stakes. And they do really well if you have really moist soils. And they do great to hold the ground together. And there's also ground cover species here, kinnikinick, sword fern, and tree species. And so we're just reiterating that layered approach to our plantings. So one important thing when planting on slopes, especially if the slopes have the potential to erode and damage structures either below the hill or up on top, it's important to have a variety of root depths. So these are 3 species of trees that have really deep-rooted roots. So the Douglas fir does really well in drier soils, though it tolerates the moisture, and it has high root strength, but typically shallow rooting characteristics in thin coastal soils, something to consider depending on where you're planting. Cascara also has a pretty deep, moderately deep taproot, and the added benefits of having berries that are a favorite of species of birds like the cedar waxwing. Willow is a great species for a number of things. Slopes is one, wet soils is one, and beavers love them, something to consider depending on your landscape. And they can be used as a live stake, which is awesome on slopes. And it's also important to have shallow rooted plants. So these are a number of plants that have more shallow roots. A lot of that is because they are smaller plants. Twinberry, nutcracker rose, snowberry, vine maple are all in that second canopy layer, shrub to moderate overstory plants. They have shallow fibrous roots, and they have a variety of conditions that they do well in, many of which include sunshine. But if you have a shadier area, sword fern does great in shade, salal does just fine in shade. Dull Oregon grape actually prefers some shade. It doesn't love full sun. Evergreen huckleberry also tolerates some shade, though it prefers sun. And all these species are great because they offer food and cover to our wildlife and pollinator species. Water conservation is hugely important in regards to greater lands being developed. If we can take advantage of the land that we have to increase water infiltration and reduce stormwater runoff. It's going to help the entire system out. There are a number of ways that we can do this. Installing a rain garden is a great way to take advantage of stormwater. Plants are really good about taking in pollutants from the soil, from the water, and turning it into food for wildlife and pollinators, and us if we so choose. And that prevents that stormwater from running off into our river systems, affecting salmon or our oceans. We can also plant buffers along creeks, and this is kind of specific to people who have riparian land or on a stream side, but it's really important to have these riparian buffers to filter and absorb the water and the nutrients and spit the oxygen back out at us, so we can all just live happy lives together. And it helps to remove and replace these hard surfaces that contribute to a lot of stormwater runoff. So even if we're not providing a solution to the problem, it is still beneficial to reduce the negative impacts that we have. And just a little note, it's another thing that is worth getting professional guidance on, and we recommend not planting within 30 feet of drainage fields or septic tanks. And this is a good link if you want to learn more about that. That's not something I have a lot of insight on myself. So when it comes to different species, we're seeing a lot of different difficulties depending on the climate struggles that are occurring more and more frequently. And that's no more noteworthy than with the cedar. We're seeing a lot of drought stress in cedar trees. So I would advise being intentional with where we're planting cedars. They prefer being in shaded areas, and that's a large part of that is water retention. They need moist to wet soils. So one way to kind of help alleviate any of the stress that they'll see is planting on north-facing slopes, just so they're not getting that direct summer sun in our summer months that a south-facing slope sees. Another way to increase the water access that our cedars have is by planting in concavities. So if you're noticing on your land that you have a spot that really accumulates puddles water in our really rainy months, that might be a great place to plant a cedar. And if you already have some cedars planted on your property that you're starting to notice might be a little drought stressed, it's worth considering a mulch ring. And, you know, peeling back any non-native species from that cedar that could be pulling water away. It's always worth removing our invasive species before we plant more, though the cedar, if they're experiencing drought stress, might not want any neighbors. It might just want a mulch ring to help hold on to more of their water. We have a lot of drought tolerant species that are on sale by the Snohomish Conservation District, and even more that are available throughout the area at other retailers. Every single one of these species does just fine going without water for a little bit. They might not thrive, but they'll survive it and come back for another season. So one thing that is important to consider for landowners, especially landowners that have large trees on their property or are considering planting large trees on their property, is storm tolerance. There have been a number of storms just in the last few months where there have been heavy gusts of wind that has knocked branches all over the roads and over people's properties, and even topped some trees or uprooted. There are a lot of ways that we can mitigate the damage from heavy windstorms. Native plants are a huge benefit. They are adapted to the climate extremes that we'll see, these natural climate events. Though not all native plants are created equal in that regard, I did a lot of research trying to find what species are good for wind and what aren't great. But more than anything, the important factors are that the trees are healthy. If they are pruned, cared for, they are free of diseases or pests, they're not experiencing stress from other factors like our cedars and drought, they're going to be less likely to be susceptible to those wind events or storm events. And a healthy tree is going to contribute to having strong roots. If they have an established, deep, extensive root system, they're going to be a lot less likely to be uprooted. And so it helps to know our soil before we plant. It helps to know the depth of that soil. If you have, a foot of soil and then there's concrete underneath from something else that was built on your land before you got there, it's worth knowing. That way you know not to plant any large trees there. And of course, we also recommend not to plant within 30 feet of a structure anyway. And that'll mitigate some concern in regards to what plants you'll have to worry about in these storm events. Any trees that have flexible wood are going to be better off for a storm. If they have flexible branches, they're going to bend rather than break. It really depends on the health of the tree more than anything. So I'm not going to say any more on what species do better than others, but always worth considering. Preventing conflicts. I know we all love our house pets. Birds don't often do, and they're not the only ones. Squirrels, amphibians, our pets are our family, but they can get into some messy situations if we let them. So if you have a pet that gets a number of outdoor time, I would recommend watching them. Or I don't know, you can get like a bell that goes on your cat's neck so that the birds are warned. There's also windows can be a threat, and that's a lot easier to minimize the impact of. I know the Audubon Society is great about passing out information on ways to prevent birds flying into windows, but there are different screen stickers that can go on that just create something a little bit different than the mirrored effect, and helps birds from flying into things that are not able to be flown through. And making sure that you are aware of where you're putting feeders and baths, and if your pets or windows are going to impact their traffic. So if you have a feeder or bath that's right next to a really clean window, maybe consider moving your feeder, and also keeping track of your pets. Always, always, always. So there are a number of resources that I use to help create this PowerPoint, and a number of resources to learn more information. I did not touch on King County Native Plant Guide, but they have a great resource. You can go into this website and pick out your specific site conditions or what you're looking for, whether that's sunny, shady, and create a personalized plant list for yourself based off of your own needs, rather than searching through all the information in your head. And that's a great resource. I've used it a number of times to create planting plans. There's also all of these others. Sound Native Plants is a great resource for other native plants in the area. And I'm going to reiterate Snohomish Conservation District. Their annual plant sale orders go live next Tuesday at 7 a.m. So if you have an interest in getting some plants soon, that's a great resource. Lots of other websites about pollinators specifically, or if you're interested in learning more about rain gardens, or also reaching out to the Snohomish Conservation District directly. Camano Island is a part of the land that Snohomish Conservation District serves. So if you're interested in getting any technical assistance, or you're interested in putting a rain garden in at your property, this is great for information, but you can also reach out directly to us. Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife also has a lot of great resources about wildlife, creating backyard habitat. If you are interested in creating a snag on your property, or if the old tree you have would be a potential snag, this is a great resource for learning more about that. WSU Master Gardeners had a lot of plant information, and it also has a lot of information regarding maintenance of plants, their health, any diagnoses, and care. And then one final plug, Snohomish Conservation District is having our annual plant sale. Orders are happening next Tuesday, January 24th. The pickup will be at Monroe Fairgrounds on March 4th and 5th. I believe the plant sale website is in the chat as well, but you can also just type in theplantSale.org and it'll take you to our website. And we also are available for any guidance. And if you have any curiosity, we are a non-regulatory agency. So we're not going to dock you if you didn't do anything with the proper permits. We'll just help you get it moving in the right way. Yeah, so that's all I have for you all. I can open it up now to questions, whether you guys want to put them in the chat box or if you want to unmute yourselves. I'd be happy to answer anything that I can.
So feel free to ask your questions verbally. I can want to give you a tip that if you are thinking about getting some plants from the plant sale, do your research in advance and get in there early. Don't wait for a week. My neighbors, I told them early and they thought a week was probably good. And they found out that a lot of things were sold out. So don't wait.
Yeah, things can sell out as early as midday that Tuesday. So know what you want ahead of time and also maybe set an alarm for 7 a.m.
So can you see the chat, Delaney? Or do you want me to
Yes,
read you questions?
Native plants that deer won't devour. That is a great question. I don't know if I can pull this up, if you guys will see this or not.
So I've just pinned you and made you larger.
Yes.
Or are you going to, is this on your screen or are you going to hold something up?
No, I have it on my computer, but it's not the screen that I'm sharing. It's just an Excel file, but I'll go over it. So species that we are selling that aren't loved by deer, not to say that they won't be, but if you're looking for ground cover, Western blue violet or Oregon stonecrop are both great species. If you want a shrub, thimbleberry, blackcap raspberry, low Oregon grape, and if you're looking for a tree, Douglas fir is probably your best bet.
So is that in the plant sale guide?
I have tried to put as much information on our plant sale website as possible, but I also have a number of more thorough notes that are just on my own computer. So I threw those species in the chat.
Okay, great.
That's a great question. And there might be even more. Those are just the few that I know of that aren't especially palatable to deer.
And there's a question about controlling moles.
I do not know much about moles. So I'm gonna, I don't know, defer to somebody else if they have that answer.
Anybody else want to share some tips on moles? It might be in Russell Link's book, Living with Wildlife. That might be a really good resource. The library has copies. You don't have to buy your own.
Mm-hmm.
Was that in your list? So Delaney, if you'll send me the 2 or 3 slides that you had with links and resources,
yeah,
I'll go ahead and put those in and share them with the email that comes out afterwards with the link to the recording.
Yeah, I can absolutely do that.
Kathy says that she's heard that daffodils deter moles. Daffodils are supposed to be good for preventing deer. I've heard that if you put daffodils around your tulips, that'll help keep the deer away from the tulips, but I don't know. Anybody else have experience with that? And there's another question in the chat about drought-resistant species.
Yeah. It looks like is this a question for where to get other native plants, or is this many groups are working hard on new drought resistant species? I'm gonna plug Snohomish Conservation District, our native plant sale. A number of the species that we're selling will do well in drought, and if you're looking for somewhere outside of Snohomish Conservation District, I can link in the chat as well.
Oh, okay. The question is where to get newer plants being developed. Our cedars and firs are fading fast. So one question there is a lot of the hybrids are not good for, I've heard that some people think that a lot of the new hybrids are not good for wildlife. Other people say that they are. Do you have an opinion about that or any research that you know about?
Yeah, I don't know anything about that.
I guess that's mainly pollinators, but cedars and firs would be more habitat cover.
Yeah. And there are a lot of ways too to just insulate our trees without needing to create new species. But by all means, let science do its thing.
Other questions? Well, thank you, Delaney. You've done a wonderful job giving us an overview of habitat and what we can look forward to in the new plant sale.
Yeah.
I need to go do my research.
I did have just one more question.
Sure.
The red currant, I have planned my whole replanting of the property I'm on based on the conservation district on Tuesday, what they are selling. But the red currant, I thought that it was okay in a dry environment. Is it not okay in dry environment? It said it doesn't mind rocky soil, but now I'm kind of thinking maybe I shouldn't be planting it in an area where I thought I'd put it.
Yeah, red flowering currant does just fine in dry soil. And the only thing it doesn't really tolerate is really wet soil or really shady areas.
Okay.
So I think it'll do just fine.
Okay, when you were speaking, I thought that I heard that it liked moist, and I was like, uh-oh, because I'm putting it in kind of a dry, sloped area. So I just was checking.
It likes moist too, but it also does dry.
So the sale on Tuesday, if I'm not on there at 7, it could sell out that fast.
Yeah, I've heard years previous that a number of species have been sold out by like 11 a.m. on that day. I think we are selling more than we have in previous years, but it's still something worth considering because we always get a number of emails like, it's sold out already, how?
All right, well, I'll have to ignore work during that hour, I guess. Because, oh dear. The plants that are dying, like the cedars and the firs, because they don't have enough water, does it help at all to kind of create a reservoir or some mulching around it, or is that a bad idea?
Yeah, mulching is a great solution to combat some of the drought that we're experiencing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I just didn't want to do something more harmful by putting something down there that might like steal nitrogen from the soil.
No, mulch is great.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
And yes, plant red flowering currant. They're beautiful. They're my favorite plant in the spring, and the hummingbirds love them, and they're just so gorgeous. So plant them, and they do well. They do well on Camano slopes with rocks. You do need to make sure they're watered the first year or two, but
Yeah, I'm going to be carrying lots of buckets because I have 0.6 acres, and I'm doing the red flowering currant and the mock orange around my whole perimeter of my property because the clearing for this land was pretty brutal. There's a lot of things I'm going to have to do to hopefully bring it back to a good state.
good for you. Good for you. That'll be really, and the hummingbirds will really thank you.
It will smell good too. Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much, and I hope to see you all at the plant sale pickup. All right, bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Oh, one other question, Delaney, you're on the website so they can write you if they have specific questions afterwards. Is that all right if I include your email in the post meeting?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, we'll do.
I also respond to the plant sale emails, so.
Oh, you do? Okay, that'll be great. All right, thank you. All right,
Yeah.
bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.